The writer and journalist Sebastian Junger has had his share of close calls. He was almost hit by the first rounds of a long burst of bullets in Afghanistan. Working as a climber for a tree company, he forgot to unlock the carabiner in his safety line. Junger begins his latest book with another close call. He was surfing off the East Coast in the dead of winter.
And I was out there by myself in a day that was, way overhead. 10, 12, 14 feet. I mean, big surf from a storm that had passed offshore. And I was by myself, and they were breaking with this just incredible violence that I later realized was a result of the winter sandbars being shaped differently than the summer sandbars. They come up more steeply. The waves are more concave. They're more hollow. The hydraulics are way more vicious. I didn't know all of this. I also didn't know that you can't hold your breath for as long in cold water. And this huge set came through.
It darkened as it came, advancing with the slow determination of something designed to kill you. More peaks were lined up behind it like the ranks of an advancing army. If the waves were starting to steepen that far out, they were true monsters. And I didn't know whether to paddle like crazy and try to get over them before they broke, or just stay put and take my beating. I stopped paddling and sat on my board to calm myself before they hit. On the lead wave came, towering, reaching, and finally detonating right in front of me, the worst possible place. I was beyond all human intervention. I took one last breath, slipped off my board, and dove for the bottom.
It hit me with a force that I'd never experienced. It just pinned me to the sandbar under 15 feet of water. It's like getting hit by a car. And I ran out of air.
Ordinarily, the hydraulics of even a large wave dissipate in a few seconds. But this was different. It went on and on. The wave wanted me and was going to keep thrashing me in the darkness until I finally gave up and breathed in. What amazed me was how malevolent the whole thing seemed. Me? Why do you want me? I was young and had no idea the world killed people so casually.
I started gagging. My body was starting to force myself to breathe, which is the last step before you breathe in, and you breathe in water, and then that's it.
My thoughts had degenerated into a desperate, no, no, no. And then I felt the awful hydraulics slacken, not by much, but enough to sense the buoyancy of my wetsuit. That way was up. If I could hold on a little longer, I'd survive. The wetsuit was rising. I gave a few kicks. I rose more. The world started to get lighter. Everything was turning green. Everything was turning white. I was in the foam. I was in the air. I was in the world. And then I saw one more wave coming. Just as big, just as malevolent. I breathed out, breathed in, and went back down.
The next wave, for some reason, wasn't quite as powerful, although it was a monster, and I eventually got back to the beach. It was the first time that I'd almost died. And I just lay on the beach watching the clouds go by. I was struck by this thought. I almost never got to see a cloud again. And I just walked through this parallel universe that had almost happened. What that would have looked like unfolding. I was haunted by this idea that when you're drowning, it's possible that we imagine the rest of our lives as if they went on to happen. And in fact, it's only happening in our imagination in those moments as we head towards brain death underwater. And that we can't tell the difference between a dying hallucination and life. That idea really haunted me. And for years later, I would think, am I still drowning offshore? And this is just a hallucination? Or did I actually make it and here I am?
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Sebastian Junger's latest book is a meditation on death called In My Time of Dying. And as you can hear in that story, he's interested in the material experience or the phenomenon of what happens when you believe you're going to die. So he employs theology to make sense of it, and philosophy and probability and physics. His father was a physicist. But to make sense of where Junger is coming from, we need to tell one more near-death story. It's the one that anchors the book. This is from 2020, and Junger had inside him a very small artery that had a weak spot. And over the years, over decades actually, the artery developed a bubble that got bigger and bigger, and the artery wall got weaker and weaker.
And if it ruptures, you are bleeding out every bit as much as if you were stabbed in the stomach, except you're bleeding internally. If someone does you the favor of stabbing you in the stomach, when you get to the ER, the doctors know exactly what the problem is and where it is and where to put their finger to stop the bleeding. But with internal hemorrhage, they don't know. It's in the sort of big bowl of spaghetti that your abdomen is. So abdominal hemorrhage is a total killer. My odds of surviving were probably 30% if I got to the hospital quickly, and it took me an hour and a half. So the way this unfolded was that we're in this house in a rural part of Massachusetts with no cell phone service. The landlines don't work when it rains because the lines are old and they short out. So the family up the road that we knew very well, these wonderful teenage girls who offered to babysit one afternoon. And so my wife and I went off. There's a cabin that's even deeper in the woods, even more remote, and we went there just for some alone time. And in mid-sentence, I feel the streak of pain in my abdomen. And I finally stand up to kind of walk it out. And I almost fell over. What I didn't know was that the aneurysm in my pancreatic artery that had been there my whole life that I didn't know about had chosen that moment to rupture. And now I'm losing a pint of blood probably every 10 or 15 minutes into my own abdomen. And there's about 10 pints of blood in the human body. And if you lose half your blood, you're probably dead. I was literally a human hourglass. And it was 90 minutes before I got to help. Your body goes into something called compensatory shock if you're experiencing dangerous blood loss, right? So the body in its sort of crazy wisdom knows that there's like a 5-alarm fire going on and it needs all the blood it can conserve. So it shuts down circulation to your legs, to your arms, your skin, and hoards all that precious blood in your chest cavity and your brain. So for a while, when you're in compensatory shock, you sort of reboot. So I was losing consciousness. I was going blind. My body was failing for the first 10 minutes. And then it caught itself. And I went into compensatory shock and I kind of rebooted. Tremendous pain, but I'm conscious, I'm alert, I'm no longer going blind, I'm back. And then as soon as we got to the hospital, like literally that minute, I went off a cliff. My body went out of compensatory shock and I was actively dying. I went into end-stage hemorrhagic shock. My body was convulsing. I was conscious and I was talking, but I was way, way out of it. And I needed blood desperately. So they took this large gauge needle and they put it through my neck into my jugular and established a catheter line into my jugular and started transfusing me through my neck. But while they're prepping my neck for this procedure, I'm lying in the trauma bay. And suddenly, below me to my left, this black void opens up, this black pit, this infinite black hole. And I'm getting pulled into it. And I have no idea I'm dying, but I do have this animal sense. Like if you go into the infinitely black pit, you're not coming back out. Don't go in there. And I'm panicking. And as that's happening, suddenly above me, my dead father appears in this sort of energy form. My father was an atheist and a physicist, and he died 8 years earlier. I'm a lifelong atheist, and there's my father above me. I have no idea that I'm dying. And I don't understand, like, Dad? And he communicated to me, basically, it's okay. You don't have to fight it. You can come with me. I'll take care of you. Come with me. It's all right. There's nothing to be scared of. And my response to him was, you're dead. I'm alive. Why would I want to go with you? The suggestion was almost grotesque. And I said to the doctor, you got to hurry. I'm leaving you right now. And, from there, they sent me into the cath lab, into the IR suite, and through a very long process, stopped the blood loss. And they kept pumping me full of blood until I was, full. And that saved my life.
Sebastian Junger's book takes it from there. He writes that all of us, whether we want it or not, have a relationship with death. Even when we refuse to think about it, he says, that too is its own kind of relationship.
Well, the avoidance of something establishes an avoidant relationship, and you're still in some sort of relationship with it, right? And so I'm going to try to quote Hemingway from memory. Forgive me if I get it wrong, but it was something like, obliterate something and it will endure, right? And so it's a little bit like that. Like, you just refuse to think about death. You're going to die eventually. You know that. We all know that, right? But you're just not going to think about it at all. That avoidance in itself is a kind of relationship with death. And it will affect how you live your life. And thinking about death obsessively also will affect how you live your life, right? I mean, it all affects how you live your life. But the refusal to contemplate it puts death in your life in a certain way, even by its absence. And one of the ways, and the mystics and the philosophers and the questers and seekers and shamans and et cetera, throughout the ages and around the world, we'll say, monks sleeping in their coffins, these people will say, look, one way to really experience life is to make sure you are continually in touch with the idea of death. Like when you lose touch with that, you're actually not living your life. And it's a really interesting idea. And, I have been around danger to my own life and around death as a war reporter and at risk at certain jobs that I did, like a high climber for tree companies. But throughout a lot of my adult life, I didn't really have a relationship with death. I had an avoidant relationship with death. I didn't have an honest one. And that did not come until later in my life.
I think most people would think, Sebastian Junger, he writes about these experiences, these intense experiences. He breaks them down, parses them, helps people understand them. Of course, he would write a book about the experience of almost dying. But it did make me wonder, did you know right away that you would write about this? Did you want to write about this? Or did that take a while?
No. I mean, the experience of almost dying for medical reasons, and I make the distinction between almost getting killed and almost dying. Yeah. Right? I can think of 3 or 4 times where I could plausibly say I was almost killed on that occasion, right? A bullet that hit next to my head into a sandbag, a couple of inches from my forehead. That to me is a close call, right? Like, yes, it missed me, but not by much. And the angle that saved my life is minuscule. And that qualifies as almost getting killed. Almost dying is a different matter because you experience almost dying. I now know what my body feels like and what my mind does when it's dying. I know what I am like when I'm dying. I've experienced it, right? That's very, very different from a high adrenaline sort of, damn, that bullet barely hit me. I better get my head down. That's not almost dying, right? That's just a close call. And so when this happened to me where I went through a very long, painful, and ultimately terrifying process of coming right to the threshold of death, looking over the edge into what I properly understood to be an abyss, and managed to make it back to shore, as it were. Mm-hmm. It left me psychologically devastated. It took me to a place of a kind of madness afterwards. I mean, I really was a little crazy. I mean, it almost dying is psychologically very, very destabilizing. And seeing death, your own death, experiencing it, is psychologically very destabilizing. And I struggled psychologically, emotionally in a way that combat never, ever couldn't touch. It never even came close. So afterwards, when my physical life was saved, the struggle for my sort of psychological life, psychological health began. And it was all hands on deck. I mean, I had my hands full. I didn't have the luxury to think, oh, maybe I'll write a book about this. Like, I was still in a pretty desperate fight for survival, but it was a sort of psychic survival. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, and it took a couple of years, in some abstract sense, I thought, well, I'm a writer. I write about stuff. Maybe I'll write about this. It's sort of hard to avoid the obvious thought that I should, right? But then the reality of actually writing about it was so daunting, was so depressing, it was so intimidating, so unnerving, and my sanity felt so fragile. It took a while to gain a kind of psychological agency.
I want to have you talk a little bit more about your father. There's this interesting conflict that comes with this story. And it seems like it raises one of the larger questions of the book, which is, how do you make rational sense out of the experience that you had and that others have had? There's your mother who you say had these sort of benign superstitions, as you call them. She believed in energies and chakras and thought maybe there's something to past lives, those kinds of things. But your father, he was all rationality. You guys didn't go to church as a family. You say rationality had to sort of provide the kind of reassurance that spirituality often does for some. But there's that conflict that you saw. And it's kind of part of what you get at in the book. Will you talk about this?
Well, human society has always struggled between the stories we need for emotional survival and the explanations, the understandings of the physical world that we need for physical survival.
Yeah.
Right? They're two different things. They're both very important. Now, what we don't want are stories about, say, why airplanes stay aloft and don't crash. We don't want stories about that. Yeah. We want explanations. We want explanations that have to do with, say, the airfoil and things like that, right? And velocity, airspeed, velocity, all the lift, all those things. We want explanations for that, right? But the way you can tell the difference between a story and an explanation is you can test an explanation. Like, here's my explanation for why this works this way. Here's the test to see if I'm right. I'm right or I'm wrong. But that's how you know you're in the realm of explanation. You know you're in the realm of story when the person who believes the story doesn't tell you what test you can run to confirm that it's true, right? So if someone believes in God, they don't say, I believe in God, and here's a test you can run to see if God actually exists, right? They just don't offer that, and nor should they, because they are in the realm of story. Yeah. And that people get sort of in trouble when they take these stories, which are enormously helpful emotionally for surviving this sort of weird experience of life, right? Bookended by, as far as we know, oblivion and infinity before your birth and after your death. But now during these brief 70, 80, 40, 30, 50 years, whatever it may be, we're supposed to invest all of our meaning and love and energy into this finite thing, and then poof, it goes away. That's psychologically difficult, right? So we come up with stories that make that bearable. Stories about God, about an afterlife, about reincarnation, and all of these things. God forbid you test them, because then you'll lose those stories. You'll lose their value. And God forbid we don't test the explanations, because we're going to get stuff wrong and planes are going to crash. My parents embodied that human struggle that has always, always, always been there. And so one of the odd things about rationality is that we can understand gravity and photons and the body and, an almost infinite list of physical phenomena. But at the most fundamental level, we don't know why there's a universe. We don't know. Like, we don't know what reality is. We can't even define consciousness, right? Like, these basic, we can understand, we can come up with explanations for how these things work, but not for how they got here and why, right? And one of the really interesting things for me is that at the level of quantum physics. So quantum physics is subatomic physics, right? It's sort of the realm of subatomic particles and photons and electrons and that kind of thing, right? So at that level, reality works in a completely different way than it does at the macroscopic level. So what physicists found out about 100 years ago was that a photon, if you fire a single photon at two slits in a steel plate and you don't observe it, you do not observe it while it's traveling, it will go through both slits simultaneously, right? Which is impossible in the macroscopic world. You can't walk through two doorways at the same time, but a photon will go through two slits simultaneously and strike the photographic film on the opposite side in a classic wave pattern that shows that it passed through both slits. If you do not watch it, right? If unobserved, a photon is in all places at the same time, right? Once you observe it in its movement, it can't be in all places at the same time. It has to pick one, and it goes through one slit. In other words, observing quantum reality creates the reality that you wind up observing.
Yeah.
And unobserved quantum reality is all things, and as what's called a waveform. And so the conflict between my mother and my father was a real one, between rationality and belief and spirituality and all that stuff. It's a real one, except that at the quantum level, what happens is that the stories and the explanations actually converge, because the quantum level makes no sense. We know that it works this way, but no one knows why, and no one can explain why. And that's the point where science actually, and the physicists will admit that, rational science actually starts the step off into the realm of story, and even, dare I say, the realm of religion. They actually sort of come together in quantum reality. And what I say in the book, I mean, just to sort of cut to the chase, is that, isn't there an afterlife? I mean, of course, I don't tell you which it is, because I don't know, because I don't believe anyone can know or can prove it or test for it. But what I say in the book is, if there is some kind of post-death existence, some kind of post-death continuity for the individual, if there is, and that's what I maybe encountered with my dead father hovering above me, if there is, as a thought experiment, if there is, how would it work? The way it works would probably involve something of that quantum reality where a particle could be, is in all places at the same time until it's observed. It would be on that, the explanation would be on that level of weirdness. Or there is no post-death reality. We are biological beings. And when we die, we don't know what happens after we die, because nothing happens and we keep finding nothing, right? So there's nothing to find there, so we don't know. That's the other possibility, and I think a very, very likely one. But if that's not what happens, how would this work? And it's probably involves some of the mysteries of quantum reality.
Sebastian Junger. His new book is called In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. The writer Sebastian Junger is with us today. We're talking about his book, In My Time of Dying. 4 years ago, he almost bled to death. In his book, he's quite clear he does not believe in an afterlife or in some other supernatural realm, but he had an experience he can't explain. So in the book, he's asking, what if there were some kind of rational explanation for at least how he felt when he was sure he was going to die? I want to come back to your experience covering wars. You mentioned how combat can kind of give you a sense of the randomness of death. You mentioned almost being hit in the first round of a very long burst of bullets in Afghanistan. And this is where you write about your friend Tim Hetherington. I want to ask you about him, British photographer, good friend. He took a piece of shrapnel to his groin, severed an artery, and he died, as you say in the book, looking up at the blue Mediterranean sky. What did you want to know about Tim at that moment? What did your own experience tell you about all of that?
So Tim and I were colleagues, friends, brothers. We were out at a remote outpost in eastern Afghanistan called Restrepo. It was a project that I had started in June of 2007 to document a platoon in combat for a whole deployment. Tim came on board on my second trip and started shooting video, a month or so after that. And together we shot enough video to make a documentary called Restrepo. Yeah. It was nominated for an Academy Award and was like quite a prominent film for a while. So, a few months after we were at the Oscars, we didn't win, obviously. A couple of months later, we were supposed to go on assignment to Libya to cover the Arab Spring. The Arab world was in flames. Democracy was on the march. It was a very exciting time, and we were going to go to Egypt and Libya. At the last moment, I couldn't go for personal reasons, and he was already there. I was going to join him there, and I emailed him. I was like, listen, man, I can't come. The assignment's off. So he's like, all right, I'm going to do my own thing. And he took a boat to the besieged city of Misrata on the Libyan coast. He got there by boat and started covering the combat. And, within hours, a mortar had detonated right next to him. And he took a shrapnel in his groin and he bled out, racing for the Misrata hospital in the back of a rebel pickup truck. When I found out about that, I was in shock. I was a very, very complicated reaction to it. But I always worried afterwards. I worried, like, was he okay? Like, did he know he was dying? Was he scared? Was he in pain? What was that like for him? Like, and I was just hoping that it was okay, that it wasn't ghastly and terrifying, right? I didn't know I was dying, and it occurred to me, much later, occurred to me maybe Tim didn't know either. Mm-hmm. And so after my aneurysm rupture, I almost died for identical reasons, right? I bled out. I just bled out internally rather than externally, but I bled out. And so I realized afterwards, when I came home, I took my first shower and it struck me. I was like, oh my God, now I know what it was like for Tim. Now I know. I answered the question. And then I realized, oh my God, I betrayed him a second time. Like the first time when he died, I thought, I had the standard sort of survivor's guilt, right? Like it should have been me. I should have been there to help him, to protect him, to save him. It should have been me, not him. This massive guilt trip. If he died in a car accident, I wouldn't have gone through all of that. And if I hadn't been in combat with him and he had died in combat, I wouldn't have gone through that if I'd just been his friend. But if you're in combat with someone and then they die in combat, it's your fault. It is very, very devastating and very tricky psychology around that. So then I realized, oh my God, not only did I betray him and he died some years ago, but now I survived the same thing. Yeah. I betrayed him twice. And I just started sobbing in the shower. And I stood there sobbing until the water ran cold in the shower. I just was absolutely devastated. And of course, one of the things that was going on is that almost dying is enormously traumatizing. Yeah. And way more traumatizing than combat, frankly. And one of the things that was going on, I was starting in on this long journey. I was sort of working through the trauma of this and the psychological consequences, which were very, very profound. And that, the sobbing in the shower is that sort of first tentative step that I was taking into this very, very dark, confusing place that held me captive for, I would say, a couple of years. It took a couple of years to get through this.
There's this moment, you write about how going through that experience and not dying, I guess this is what you mean when you said that you were wondering what this new part of your life was supposed to be called. Have you figured that out? Like
I've learned to not think about it too much. Yeah. I've learned to not overthink it, right? Which is what we all do with mortality, right? Like how do you live your life knowing that in some number of years, you're going to go off a cliff into oblivion, and it will be as if your life had never happened. How do you live your life? Well, you live your life by not freaking thinking about it, right? Sorry. Like, that's how you do it. I mean, don't undersell denial. Like, denial is what allows us to function. It allows firemen to charge into, if I can be just sad for a moment, the World Trade Centers before they came down. Denial is a very, very powerful and necessary thing. And, I would argue it's actually necessary for living a life where you're not paralyzed by fear of mortality. But the trick is, for me, particularly as you get a little older, the trick is that you allow in enough honest appreciation of death to illuminate life in all of its magic and extraordinariness and unlikeliness and magnificence, without allowing so much of an awareness of death that it's paralyzing. And getting the mix right, the sort of like fuel to air ratio right in your engine, in your existential engine, getting that mix right is absolutely crucial to leading a meaningful life, but that's also not paralyzed with fear.
Tell us about Tyler Carroll. There's this part of the book where you write about, and this is the thing that you hear about a lot. People say, my life flashed before me. But it's a thing. Researchers call it a life review, and it happened to Tyler. Tell us about him.
Yeah. So often when people say my life flashed before my eyes, what their meaning is that they had a car accident, and in that moment they have an awareness that they might die.
Yeah.
Right. And I think what they really mean is my death flashed before my eyes. I saw my death. Right. I mean, it's a little bit of a misnomer. But a life review is something that happens while people are dying, right? And their heart stops, the perfusion to their brain stops, the brain starts dying, very, very quickly when it doesn't get oxygenated blood. And so Tyler Carroll was a combat medic who was wounded in Afghanistan in the shoulder. And he bled out, just like I did. He bled out. And instead of seeing a dark pit and his dead father, as he said to me, and he was like 20 years old when this happened, he said, I didn't see any dead people because I don't know any. Like, I'm too young to say, there aren't any dead people in my life to come help me when I die because I'm too young. I don't know any dead people. So what happened to him is, he said, as he was trying to treat another wounded soldier, and he would, like me, he was going in and out of consciousness and not knowing it. Right. So he would lose consciousness and sort of slump over, and then he'd wake up like I would, and he'd go back to trying to treat the soldier, and then he'd go out again, and he just went back and forth for quite a while, and he almost died. And his life review, he said he was in this very peaceful, beautiful place where he could sort of he could perceive all the moments of his entire life and all the people in it simultaneously. It wasn't sequential, it was simultaneous. That's a life review. And, the big question, of course, between the spiritualists and the skeptics is, is this just a psychological, a neurological phenomenon, right? The dying brain produces, as when you take LSD or what have you, or epileptic seizures or things like that, the dying brain might produce hallucinations. And that's what these phenomena are. Or, as some researchers believe, these amount to some evidence, not proof, but evidence of an afterlife. What they call, I hate the word afterlife, but what is commonly known as an afterlife. Yeah. And, so, okay, game on between the rationalists and the hopefuls, right? And it has not been settled. And my book, sort of presents both cases and then tries to sort of tease something out of this one thing that still bothers me about the rationalist explanation. And I'm, if nothing else, I'm a rationalist, right? I mean, absolutely. But rationalists must be skeptical even of their own rationality, right? Like, that's the nature of skepticism, is to doubt everything, including skepticism. So I'm with the rationalists all the way. Yeah, neurochemicals and et cetera, et cetera. Like, I got it. Yeah, like you explained almost everything, except for one thing. And this has always sort of bugged me. Like, if you give a room full of people LSD, 100% of them will hallucinate, right? It's a neurological phenomenon. It's well understood. There's no mystery there. but they will not all hallucinate the same thing, right? And the strange thing about dying people, they're often actively in conversation with dead people in the room that no one else can see, their dead brother, their dead mother, what have you.
Yeah.
And so one of the strange things for me is that, okay, I get it, the dying brain can hallucinate, but I don't quite get the explanation of the consistency of the hallucinations, like why the dead? You actually can't explain the content of a hallucination through neurochemistry, only the phenomenon of hallucinations. And that's where I say in the book, okay, almost certainly we're biological beings. There is no post-death existence. Sorry, nice try. Sorry, let's be real here. But just for argument's sake, if there were, or against all odds, if there were a post-death existence, hypothetically, how would it conceivably work according to to science as we understand it today? What would theoretically, how would it possibly work? If Lincoln hadn't been assassinated, what would have happened in America? It's a thought experiment, right? If there were a post-death existence, how would that work according to the physics as we understand it? And that's where I go into sort of the just sheer strangeness of quantum phenomena.
Sebastian Junger. He's a journalist and writer. His books include The Perfect Storm and Tribe. His latest is In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. We'll take another break. Come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. You're listening to Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Back now to our conversation with the writer Sebastian Junger. We're talking about his new book, In My Time of Dying. Your father, as we've talked about, was really incredibly irrational. He believed in souls, something like a soul. This is how you write it in the book. Your father believed in souls, but he never looked up at the stars. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think what I say in the book is that he found the immensity of the stars terrifying.
Yeah.
A word is such a rough approximation of the thing that the word's referring to, right? So we're stuck with words like soul that have Christian connotations and all kinds of other stuff attached to it that you made up. But what's a better word, right? We're stuck with the words, right? So my father, who was an atheist, as I said, he had to resort to the, word soul. But what he meant was, in this hyper-rational way of his, he felt like many physicists who at heart, physicists are kind of mystics. I mean, they're a really interesting blend of rationality and something else, right? Because as rationalists, they know that they don't understand everything, and that they also know that everything might not even be understandable, right? So my father believed that the soul or the individual consciousness was like a wave on a body of water, and that it was part of this vast sort of soul matter, this vast colossus of consciousness that exists in the universe. But it had briefly its own waveform for a little while, and his specialty in physics was acoustics, which is the study of pressure waves in a medium, right? So he knew all about waves. And if you create a pressure wave, say through wind action on the surface of the ocean, or a sound vibration, you create a pressure wave that eventually dissipates because of entropy. It eventually dissipates, and that pressure wave subsides and again becomes indistinguishable from the rest of the water molecules or air molecules or whatever it may be that is the medium that it's in. And so he felt that was true for the human identity, that we were part of the stuff of the universe, and we existed briefly in a kind of waveform from this initial sort of pulse of energy that happens at birth, and then very gradually, or rapidly, if you want to see it the other way around, entropy wears us down and wears us down until we reach the maximum entropy of death and decomposition.
Yeah.
into the soil, and so that to him was like what the soul was, and it gave him a kind of comfort that you're not alone in that on some level you're part of everything. And I will say an anecdote that I read after finishing the book, but it's really quite dear to me, quite valued by me, is something that happened to the Russian writer Dostoevsky when he was in his 20s. Long before he was a famous writer, he was a sort of young left-wing firebrand in Tsarist Russia, and he and his friends would get together, and this is like the 1840s, to talk about outrageous ideas like freeing the serfs and things like that, right? Mm. And that kind of talk was not appreciated by the Tsar. And eventually the Tsar's police picked up Dostoevsky and his buddies and threw him in prison. And they spent 8 months in prison. It wasn't a particularly severe transgression. And so it wasn't a serious transgression. So they didn't think much about it. So they did their time in prison. And then they, were let out after 8 months and put into a wagon to be, presumably driven to the courthouse to be sort of discharged to their families. Oh, happy day. Like, we're going home, finally. Wow, why did it take so long, right? But instead, to their horror, to their shock, they were driven to a city square, and they were told to get out of the wagon, and they were tied to posts and realized that they were in front of a firing squad and that they were about to be executed. And these young men had to make the transition from, I'm going home, to, I'm going to be dead in a few minutes. They had to make that transition almost instantaneously. And Dostoevsky looked out, the order was given, charge your rifles, ready, aim. They're waiting for the command to fire. And Dostoevsky looked out. He was in the second string of people who are going to be executed, right? And he looked out and he saw sunlight glinting off a church steeple. And in this moment of clarity about existence and life, he thought, in a few minutes, I will become part of the sunshine. I will become part of all things. At the last moment, a rider galloped into the square and said, the Tsar forgives them. The Tsar forgives them. Untie them. It was all staged. It was a very, very cruel mock execution. Two of the young men were insane for the rest of their lives. It broke them psychologically. And having gone through what I went through, I kind of understand what happened to those men, right? I can imagine myself not quite coming back from what I experienced as well. Dostoevsky, for whatever reason, managed to take that profound insight into the nature of our existence in the universe and turn it into some of the most extraordinary literature ever written. And so that, in some ways, what my father was getting at. We're from all things, and we will go back to being of all things when we die.
You had an experience with him when you were younger. I think you were 16. You went camping. That's how you end the book with this story. You still, as you've talked about, don't have an explanation for how your dead father sort of appears to you when you're going through this experience. There's still a lot of questions about that nurse that we talked about. Questions of what to make of the fact that you sat up at exactly 3:15 in the morning, the same moment your father died. There's a lot of things that it seems like you're just going to have to be okay with hanging out there. But there was a moment that you drew from this camping experience that I wanted you to talk about that did tell you something. Would you say that, something about that finally?
So the thing about rationality, it's a very powerful tool. The rational process is why planes fly and computers work and everything else, right? But the problem with it is that things keep happening that we can't explain. And that's the central endeavor of my book, is to sort of come to grips with that. But at the end of the day, yeah, we are these incredibly rational brains. Our brains are extraordinary. They're the most complex structures in the known universe, right? But at the end of the day, we're human beings. We're social primates. We love people. My father showing up dead above me, was in some way, he was on the spectrum. He was a physicist. He was on the spectrum. Emotionally, he was quite hard to reach. He He was a lovely man, but lacked a lot of skills for parenting, right? It was in some ways the most profound, pure act of love that he ever gave me.
Wow.
Showing up above me as I was dying, above me in the trauma bay, right? And it made me think about this strange reversal that happened when I was about 16 years old. You know, my father, he was a brilliant, brilliant man, and like many brilliant people, also emotionally, sometimes a little bit of a child, and had to kind of be cared for in a really interesting way. And so he grew up in pre-war Europe, classically educated. He had never slept outside in his life, not once, right? And I grew up camping and backpacking and going into the woods, and that was my world. And when I was 16, I decided, and it was like November, and it's, I lived in Boston, and I was like, Dad, we're going to go camping in the mountains of New Hampshire, right? It's time for you. You're 50-something years old. It's time for you to sleep outside. Sorry, this is happening now.
Right.
So I took him out there, and we were climbing this mountain. I can't remember where it was, somewhere in the presidential range. And it got dark quite quickly, and we were quite high up, and there was nobody out there, right? It's, mid-November or something. And I realized, we're going to have to make camp. And he was incoherent. He had hypothermia. He wasn't making sense. He became totally passive. And it's getting dark, and it's getting very cold. And I realized, wow, I got to save this. This is on me. I'm 16 years old, and I'm going to have to take care of him. But I knew what I was doing. And I got some birch bark, and I started a little flame, and I got some twigs, and I got a fire going. I got the fire up, and I pitched the tent, and I put him in a sleeping bag, and I warmed up some soup on the fire. And he was very passive. He didn't want to drink soup. He didn't want to do anything. He just wanted to go to sleep. And I was terrified of him going to sleep. I finally got some warm soup in him, and he stopped shaking. And he quietened down. It was just like an adult looking after a child as they go to sleep. I just sat there watching him, watching his chest rise and fall in this great sort of Arctic night that was around, darkness that was around us, beyond the reach of any help. There's no cell phone. This is the 70s. There's no cell phones. There's nothing, right? And I just watched my father slowly drift to sleep, just like a little baby. And, as he regained his mind, he sort of returned to being my father, and I returned to being his son. But what I was able to do was see him through into his sleep. And, he woke up in the morning, and he was fine. But it was this beautiful sort of caretaking moment where the roles were reversed. And I watched that over him. And I say at the end of the book, like, the point of all of this, like, we're all on the side of a mountain, stunned by how fast it's gotten dark. I'm 62. I can't believe I'm 62. The last time I checked, I was 30. I mean, are you kidding? What happened? It's dark now? It's getting dark? The day's almost done? Are you kidding? Like, that's life, right? And so the important thing on the side of the mountain as it suddenly gets dark isn't your religion or your faith or your science or your beliefs, whatever. It's that you're with someone who loves you, and they will look out after you, and you will look out after them when one of you heads out into the great soaring night, either for a baby falling asleep or for a person who's passing into death. Like, that's the point. That is the point of love and of human existence, is to make sure that happens for all of us as parents with our children, and that our children for us when we die, they watch out over us as we pass along, just like we watched out over them as they would fall asleep in our laps. And that's what life is. And if you really plug into that, it really doesn't matter what religion you believe or whether you believe anything at all.
Sebastian Junger, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Sebastian Junger, his new book is called In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. Our thanks to Simon & Schuster for their permission to use clips from the audiobook. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube at KUER 90.1. If you have ideas or comments, you can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. And join us tomorrow for a backstory for the Ten Commandments. Louisiana and Oklahoma are the latest states to require the public use of them, but where exactly did the Ten Commandments come from? The program is produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Carrie Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.